The night was alive with the soft hum of laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses as respected members of the community gathered under the warm glow of the chandeliers. Bankers, doctors, lawyers, and even a local judge mingled gracefully, their conversations drifting through the grand room. Among them, Coleman Reeves stood with an air of absolute authority, though his sharp eyes occasionally darted toward the entrance. Alex, a younger associate whose impatience was getting the better of him, stepped up to Coleman, his voice carrying a notch too high for such a refined setting. Coleman immediately raised a hand, his tone smooth yet firm, advising Alex not to raise his voice like a common street hoodlum when surrounded by such distinguished company. Alex quickly apologized, explaining that he was simply anxious about the scheduled delivery, which was already long overdue. Coleman offered a calm smile, reassuring him that everything would arrive in due time, and suggested Alex grab a refill at the bar while he tended to other matters. A short distance away, Danny sat comfortably in an armchair, deeply engrossed in a mystery novel. Vince strolled over, looking at the book with a casual smirk, noting that he had already figured out the identity of the killer after reading just the first few pages. He encouraged his younger brother to put the book down and join the celebration. Danny chuckled softly, replying that he was quite comfortable where he was. Vince gave a light-hearted nod, remarking that Danny had better finish his reading now, as he would hardly have any free time once he relocated to Phoenix to manage the family business. At the mention of Phoenix, Danny hesitated, attempting to explain that he had second thoughts about leaving. Before he could elaborate, his father, Coleman, approached the brothers. Coleman made it clear that he did not wish to debate the matter, stating firmly that he needed his son in Phoenix to run the extensive linen operation, a facility that supplied half the state with its supplies. Danny gently countered that an experienced manager was already handling the property and that the real excitement was right here at home. Coleman gently reminded him that an outsider could never replace family, and besides, the dry climate in Arizona would do wonders for Danny's asthma. Just then, a house staff member called out that there was an urgent phone call for Coleman. Coleman excused himself and took the receiver, his expression softening as he greeted his contact, Andre. After exchanging pleasant pleasantries about the lovely weather in the Bahamas, Coleman steered the conversation toward the late shipment. Andre reassured him that the package was moving smoothly and would arrive shortly. Coleman confirmed that his team would be ready at the drop zone, sent his warm regards to Andre's wife, and concluded the call. Returning to the main room, Coleman found Vince waiting with a look of quiet anticipation. Vince asked if that was the call they had been expecting, and Coleman confirmed it was indeed Andre. Turning to Danny, Vince playfully suggested that his younger brother step in to finish their ongoing game and take good care of Joanna while he stepped away. Danny smiled warmly, asking if Vince was sure he wanted to give up his spot. Vince laughed it off before stepping aside with their father to discuss the final logistics. In low tones, Coleman revealed to Vince that the incoming shipment was arriving that very day. Out on the desolate dirt strip near the mountains, 2 smoke flares sent thick gray trails into the afternoon sky. A private plane touched down, its engine roaring before coming to a halt. The pilot stepped out, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. 2 waiting couriers approached, demanding the package immediately. The pilot held his ground, insisting on cash upon delivery as agreed. Suddenly, a figure wearing a heavy ski mask and brandishing a sawed-off shotgun burst from the nearby brush, commanding everyone to halt and drop their weapons. Overpowered by the unexpected ambush, the couriers surrendered the briefcase. The masked thief snatched the money, sprinted to a nearby vehicle, and sped off into the distance, leaving the stranded men shouting in frustration. The following morning, at a quiet local airfield, Private Investigator Barnaby Jones and his young associate, Jedediah, met with the grieving widow of Sam Fields. Mrs. Fields expressed her deep sorrow and confusion, insisting that her husband had been an expert pilot since the age of 16 and could not have simply made a fatal mistake near his own aircraft propeller. She mentioned that despite what the official report stated, $5,000 in cash that Sam was carrying had completely vanished. She explained that over the past few months, Sam had been hired for private flights to the Bahamas by way of Mexico to make ends meet during tough financial times. Barnaby listened intently, promising her that he and Jedediah would look thoroughly into the matter. Examining the damaged aircraft, Jedediah pointed out 2 burned-out smoke flares resting in the tall grass nearby. Barnaby pondered why a pilot would need smoke flares after landing, deducing that someone on the ground must have lit them to guide the arrival. Meanwhile, Nat Lewis, a local mechanic with a shady past, observed the investigators from afar and quickly made a discreet phone call to report that a sharp detective named Barnaby Jones was asking questions. Inside the corporate offices of the Capricorn Investment Corporation, tension was running high. Coleman Reeves sat behind his large wooden desk, his face stern as Alex, and Vince stood before him. Vince was visibly shaken, admitting that they had been robbed of $460,000, a massive sum that he felt personally responsible for. Coleman reminded everyone that their primary duty was to process and clean the funds safely, and losing such a delivery was unacceptable. He instructed his main enforcer, Fred Bender, to hit the streets immediately to see if anyone was suddenly spending large amounts of cash or paying off old debts. At the same time, Coleman quietly instructed Vince to keep a close eye on their own inner circle, starting with Fred himself. Danny entered the office shortly after, sensing the heavy atmosphere. He offered to postpone his trip to Phoenix to help the family through this difficult crisis, emphasizing that family should stick together in times of trouble. Coleman appreciated the sentiment, telling Danny they would discuss it later. After Danny left, Coleman received another call from Andre, who agreed to send a replacement shipment of $500,000 through Mexico late that night. Coleman selected an abandoned ranch property in the North Valley as the new drop site, determined to catch whoever had crossed them. Later that evening at a quiet lounge, Jedediah struck up a friendly conversation with Marianne, a perceptive waitress who worked at the nearby Airfield Club. Through their easygoing banter, Jedediah gathered crucial details about the local pilots and learned about Vince Reeves and his high-profile father, Coleman Reeves. Combining this fresh insight with Barnaby's expertise, the 2 detectives realized that the late Sam Fields had been recruited into an elaborate money laundering scheme involving gambling proceeds from the Bahamas. At the same time, Vince was making secret preparations for the new drop. He met with a substitute pilot named Jim Cave, instructing him to change the original flight route. Instead of flying all the way from the Bahamas, Jim was ordered to perform a short hop from Santa Monica to the secluded North Valley Ranch, where Fred Bender would be waiting to receive the suitcase and hand over $5,000 in cash. However, the North Valley operation quickly descended into chaos. As Jim handed the leather case to Fred near the edge of the woods, the same masked figure carrying a shotgun emerged from the shadows, demanding the briefcase at gunpoint. Fred surrendered the case without a fight, but as the thief retreated into the brush, Fred drew his sidearm and gave chase. Vince Reeves, who had been watching the exchange from a hidden position nearby, slipped through the trees to intervene. Moments later, a single gunshot echoed through the valley. By the next morning, news reached Barnaby Jones that Vince Reeves had been found dead in the woods, shot through the chest. Lieutenant Biddle of the local police department met with Barnaby at the scene, confirming the tragedy and noting that Vince's associates had mysteriously vanished from town. Barnaby expressed his strong belief that Vince was the key piece of the puzzle and that his missing bodyguard, Fred Bender, held the answers to the mystery. At the Reeves residence, a heavy cloud of grief hung over the family. Coleman sat in silent sorrow, mourning the loss of his eldest son. Danny approached his father gently, expressing his own deep grief for his brother and asking for a chance to step up, take on real responsibility, and remain by his father's side rather than moving to Phoenix. Coleman, overcome with emotion, embraced Danny, agreeing that they only had each other now. Shortly after, Joanna Morgan arrived in tears, seeking comfort. Danny held her softly, reassuring her that he would always be there to support her through the difficult times ahead. Barnaby and Jedediah tracked Jim Cave down to his aunt's apartment. After a tense moment at the door, Jim agreed to speak with the detectives. He recounted the harrowing events at the North Valley Ranch, explaining how the masked gunman had ambushed the exchange, how Fred had pursued the attacker into the forest, and how he had seen Vince creeping through the woods right before the fatal shot was fired. Barnaby strongly advised Jim to seek official protection at police headquarters, to which Jim agreed. Meanwhile, Danny's demeanor began to transform. He removed his thick glasses, revealing a newfound confidence that caught Joanna's attention when they met later that afternoon. As they spoke softly about the future, the landline phone rang. Danny answered it to hear the gruff voice of Fred Bender on the line. Fred revealed that he had identified the getaway car used during the robbery, discovering it had been rented by an alias tied directly to Danny. Fred accused Danny of setting up the robbery and causing Vince's death, demanding $100,000 in exchange for his absolute silence and permanent disappearance. Danny agreed to the blackmail, setting up a meeting at an abandoned bottling plant on Commerce and 3rd Street for noon the following day. Knowing the pressure was building, Coleman told Danny that private investigator Barnaby Jones was getting far too close to their affairs and needed to be dealt with. Danny eagerly volunteered to handle the situation himself, begging his father for an opportunity to prove his capability and make him proud. Coleman reluctantly agreed, placing his trust in his remaining son. The next afternoon, Danny walked into the dusty, dimly lit interior of the abandoned bottling plant carrying a heavy duffel bag. Fred Bender stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, his gun drawn. Danny handed over the bag containing the requested $100,000, remarks flying between them about the nerve it took to rob his own father. Suddenly, Coleman Reeves stepped out from the shadows, accompanied by several armed men. Coleman revealed that his team had found Fred an hour earlier and that Fred had confessed everything. With tears of anger and disappointment in his eyes, Coleman confronted Danny, asking why he would commit such a betrayal and cause his brother's death. Danny, overcome with emotion, explained that he never intended for Vince to get hurt and that the robbery was simply a desperate attempt to prove his own worth. He confessed that all his life, he had craved his father's respect and affection, feeling constantly overshadowed by Vince. Coleman softened slightly, realizing the deep emotional pain his son had carried, but noted sorrowfully that respect could never be earned through deceit. Moments later, the side door of the building creaked open, and Barnaby Jones stepped cautiously into the facility, having been tipped off about Fred's location. Danny instantly drew a hidden firearm and pointed it at Barnaby, commanding him to drop his weapon. Barnaby calmly complied, throwing his gun aside while observing the dramatic family confrontation before him. Danny boasted that he was finally taking care of the detective just as he had promised his father. However, before any further harm could be done, police sirens began to wail outside the building. Lieutenant Biddle and a team of officers burst through the entryways with weapons raised, surrounding Coleman, Danny, and their associates. Barnaby gave a light smile, revealing that he had alerted the authorities before entering the building. As the officers moved in to place handcuffs on Coleman and Danny, Coleman looked at his son with a heavy sigh, offering a weary reflection on how difficult it was to guide the younger generation. Danny looked back at his father with a quiet, accepting smile, knowing that their complex journey had finally reached its end. Barnaby retrieved his hat, adjusted his coat, and walked out into the warm afternoon sun alongside Jedediah, ready to enjoy a well-deserved moment of peace.